Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's webinar. It seems to be getting slightly cold around here tonight. I don't know with you. I think winter is actually finally coming upon us. But thank you for joining us tonight for future-proofing your flock strategies for reducing your carbon footprint. And it's nice to have a webinar that's more focused on sheep. So thank you for joining us this evening. And our expert this evening is Poppy Frater. She is a sheep and grassland specialist as part of the National Beef and Sheep Specialist team at SAC Consulting. As part of her role, she has lots of knowledge on sheep nutrition, flock performance and grassland management. She contributes to a variety of KE activity throughout Scotland and England. And prior to this, I actually worked with Poppy at HDB, and before that, before starting SAC, she also worked at Farmax. She enjoys working with farmers who are keen to make more of their pasture, and alongside her role, she is also completing a PhD entitled Is Mob Grazing Beneficial to Soil Health and Environment? She really believes that pasture management is key opportunity to improve your farm sustainability and to drive more about the role of carbon sequestration on livestock farms. So I'll hand you over to Poppy, and as usual, you'll all stay muted throughout. But if you have got a burning question as we go through, then do put your hand up or type it in the chat and I'll ask it as we go through. Or we'll just do all the questions at the end if it's not specific for a certain slide. So thank you very much, Poppy, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, thank you for that introduction as well. Like Katie said, I cover mainly in Scotland actually, so I don't know if there's any Scottish farmers in the group. But yeah, mainly working in Scotland as part of this national livestock team. I'm just going to share this.
We have got Scottish farmers, although I'm not sure any are actually on tonight yet, but I'm sure that others will join or watch online.
Great. Okay. So for tonight's presentation, I'm going to talk all about opportunities to improve the flock carbon footprint. And I guess what I would like is for you to think beyond box ticking exercises, even beyond what the consumer's demanding, to the real objective here, which is limiting the effect of climate change. I think the weather is becoming more erratic. As Kate said, it is a bit chillier now, but it has been quite, well, around here it's been quite a warm November, which perhaps isn't a problem for us, but the flooding that's been in Spain or the droughts that have been in other parts of the world, climate change is affecting us, whether it be directly or indirectly through the changes in input costs and food scarcity. And I know sort of saying this does risk putting greater burden on farmers like yourselves, and I know as the general public, we are demanding an ever-growing list of things for farmers to do. But I do think that the tide is shifting. I think farming is seen as more of being part of the solution, I'd like to say, than being the problem. And hopefully that'll come through in my slides tonight. I think as a group, you're responsible for a lot of land in the UK, and I think that represents a huge potential to make a difference. Just to kind of set the scene, I know you probably heard a lot of this to death, but to set the scene, the relevant gases we talk about in livestock farming, the biggie that we often talk about is methane. And the reason methane is talked about a lot is because it is much more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. So it seems to trap about 30 times more heat than carbon dioxide, so it's 30 times more potent in a global warming context than carbon dioxide. So that's the reason. However, we also acknowledge, and I think IPCC, you know, the body responsible for monitoring our global and national emissions, are acknowledging the fact that methane is part of a cycle, particularly from livestock. It's a biogenic gas. It's part of a natural biological cycle. So it's good that we're starting to get that acknowledged. And it doesn't last in the environment as long as carbon dioxide. So methane typically lasts in the environment for like 12 to 14 years, whereas carbon dioxide, you're looking at 100 years. So that's good. But it does mean that methane is still a big opportunity to reduce greenhouse gases, because if we stop producing carbon dioxide tomorrow, those emissions produced up till today will be locked in for 100 years. Whereas if we stop producing methane tomorrow, those emissions produced today are only locked in for 12 to 14 years. So you can see that we can have a much quicker impact on this global problem. So that's why I think it should be seen as us as sort of ruminant producers, seen as more that we're part of the solution. We're doing our bit to reduce methane. And I'm not saying let's let off the fossil fuel industry off the hook. All these other industries absolutely need to do their part as well, but it's helping us gain traction quicker. The other gas we talk about a lot when it comes to livestock farming and farming in general is nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is worse again. So it's nearly 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So every molecule of nitrous oxide was, well, from about 260 to 300 times more heat trapping than carbon dioxide. So it's a real baddie. So yeah, any opportunities, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we can focus in on this baddie as well. Perhaps less talked about is ammonia. Ammonia isn't a greenhouse gas in itself. However, it is problematic as an environmental pollutant, but also it can be redeposited on the soil and then converted to the baddie that is nitrous oxide. So that's why it's termed an indirect greenhouse gas. And then, of course, carbon dioxide is still relevant, but less so on a flock basis in terms of fossil fuel combustion, and also when land has changed. So when it's cultivated and perhaps changed from grass and arable land, there might be a release of carbon dioxide. So just focusing in on things we can do to reduce nitrous oxide and ammonia emissions. The key one really is reduce nitrogen fertilizer use. I'm not saying eliminate altogether. I think sometimes there's even an environmental argument for some nitrogen fertilizer use, but I would say reduce dependency on nitrogen fertilizer altogether, and using it sort of strategically will help this biggie greenhouse gas, and also improve resilience to the nitrogen fertilizer price. There are some pasture species which are beneficial. I know Katie was saying you had Trogascon talking about herbal lays. And this pasture species, which is plantain, has actually been shown to help reduce nitrous oxide emissions in the ground. So it's got a whole host of other benefits, which I'll talk later on, but it seems to be beneficial in this regard too. Nitrous oxide can be released again when soil is disturbed due to the oxygen influencing the nitrogen cycle in the soil. So minimizing disturbance is beneficial. And then when we're talking about the spreading of organic manures, it's important to remember that if it's not incorporated, it's left on the surface, and if it's spread in hot, windy conditions, you're going to get that release of ammonia into the atmosphere, which represents a waste of that nitrogen, but also, again, it's potentially adding to these nitrous oxide emissions. When it comes to methane, there are two sort of areas that we can look at on an individual basis, but then I'll talk later on. There's areas that we can look at in terms of improving flock efficiency, which reduces the methane emissions per kilogram of output. But bigger animals tend to have bigger rumens, and bigger rumens produce more methane. So animal size is a consideration there. And also health management. We know that animals that have a high parasite burden, for instance, have greater methane emissions. So there's these two key areas which can be perhaps focused in on to help reduce this. Coming down the line, perhaps less available to you guys as producers now, is the breeding, the ability to breed for reduced methane. We know there is variation within breeds of methane production. And my research colleagues at SRUC, they have, and other institutes, I should say, but they have this ability to actually measure the methane produced on an individual basis, with the aim that that will become part of our selection programs into the future, if it's proven to be effective. And then again, also in development, not that I'm going to talk about it in too much detail tonight, but there is potential for vaccination to reduce methane emissions, and there is the potential for certain feed additives. I think there's one feed additive on the market, which is incorporated to reduce methane. Now, there are a number of carbon footprinting tools available. I'm going to talk a little, well, I'm just going to mention AgriCalc here because we have a close association with AgriCalc, so there is that conflict of interest, I guess. But there are other tools out there, and I think the value of these tools, they are models, and we have to remember that models, they don't always, they can struggle to capture all the complexities of a full farm system, but they do a better job than what we can with measuring. So all models are always sort of striving to get closer and closer to the truth. But all models have some areas of perhaps uncertainty. But what these models enable us to do is they enable us to look at areas in the flock or in the herd that might be opportunity areas for improvement. So this was one example farm, and what this report did is it compared the flock entered into the carbon footprinting tool with the average for that category. So in this instance, it was a good hill flock. And what you can see is that for the different elements of the carbon footprint, so enteric fermentation is the methane, and manure management is the methane and ammonia as a result of the manure. And the other elements, as you can see how that business compared with the average for that group, which gives an understanding of where the opportunities lie for improvement. And so in this case, in fact, it was quite a good example, but in this case, there was basically two areas that kind of highlighted as for a medium area of improvement. So fertilizer and purchase feeds. And I think what's useful, one, is it helps understand these areas and focus in on where improvements can be made, but two would be looking at the trends over time and helping hone in on the direction that you're going and the key areas that are relevant to your context, because it's really tricky, even within a category, it's really tricky to capture all contexts. Now, sorry, I'll just go back again. Now, there is kind of, I guess, when I first started and learning about carbon footprints, there was a bit of a debate in terms of how we report it. So you can report it per hectare, you can report it total. But as food producers, I think it's important to report it in the context of what you're producing. So that's why it's often reported on a kilogram of product, in this instance, kilogram dead weight, but it can be reported kilogram live weight as well, to acknowledge the fact that you're food producers, and if you were to reduce gases on a hectare basis and reduce food, then that would have to be produced elsewhere with the potential of greater emissions there. So it's important to report it on a kilogram dead weight basis. so for this reason, I would argue that improving ewe efficiency and flock efficiency is going to have a great impact on your farm carbon footprint, because the methane emissions of that ewe is spread over greater kilograms of lamb. So a ewe producing 2 lambs as opposed to 1 lamb will be able to spread her methane emissions over twice the amount of meat. So you can see it'll have quite a big effect on that end result. And in our industry, we talk about targets in terms of ewe efficiency, and we kind of developed this target of rearing the ewe's weight in lamb. So that's a very efficient ewe. And again, what I would encourage with all of these targets is to monitor what you do and develop a target relative to your system, because this might be a little bit more challenging for a hard hill system as opposed to a lowland system. But it's just a kind of rough and ready target as a way to spread those methane emissions over more kilos of meat. And you can see what that looks like across different sizes of ewes. So for instance, a 75 kilo ewe would need to rear 1.76 lambs or 176 lambs at the flock level. Whereas, you know, a 50 kilo ewe, it might be lighter lambs, but it's a much smaller rearing percentage that would be required to achieve that target. And that's sort of twofold beneficial to the carbon footprint, because it means that, one, the smaller ewes, like I said before, smaller ewes, smaller rumens, less methane production, but also the resources required to maintain a heavier ewe are greater than a lighter ewe, and therefore the emissions associated with those, say feed and fertilizer and things, are greater often for a heavier ewe. And it's important to factor in, of course, as you get lighter and lighter, that the lamb growth rates might be impacted. So that's why it's important to factor both sides of the coin there. So I just wanted to put forth these sort of targets. I've not put scanning percentage here because I know it will vary for all the different systems that might be represented on the call. But these represent like sort of wastage from scanning to sale. So, and also if you think barren ewes, you know, they're passengers in the system producing methane, and that methane's not being spread over any kilos of product at the end of the year. So I've just sort of put across some targets in terms of barren rates, those that use it, those passengers, I guess, that fail to lamb, ewe mortality as well, because the more that die, the greater requirement for replacements. And again, those replacements are substituting lamb that can be sold. Flock replacements targets, I know that might range depending on where you're going with the flock. And then lamb mortality again, so totaling up to about less than 15% from scan to sale. And then finally,
we've got a hand up. Harry,
yeah.
Do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
Oh yeah, so just going back to the graph, the table about the two farms, well, the average and the farm. There's room for improvement in the fertilizer and purchase feed, but potentially if he reduces that, his total emissions could go up because of the he'll be producing less kilogram dead weight and stuff like that. Could apply there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's important. It's done. It'll be factored in if they reduce these two measures, and also it resulted in a reduction in their kilos of dead weight. Then this figure will look worse. So that'll be factored in if they do. But there are means to improve efficiency. So, for instance, and I'll talk a bit about that later on, so that you can reduce your feed and fertilizer without resulting in a reduction in production.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a good question. Yeah. So the way I like to sort of perhaps oversimplify it, but in terms of achieving some of these targets, I think of these sort of 3 key areas. So genetics, nutrition, and health. These 3 areas can make what I think are the building blocks of flock efficiency. So in terms of genetics, I think in terms of selecting rams for replacements, so those that are breeding their own ewe replacements, looking at the EBVs in terms of maternal ability, mature size of the ewes, litter size, the full maternal index, and also some breeds have included lamb survival, lambing ease, and longevity, and just critiquing the EBVs for to suit the issues and the opportunities that are on your farm. So if you deem, for instance, mature size to be an issue, perhaps that'll be one that you keep an eye on for selection as a selection criteria for rams for replacements. For those that are buying in their ewe replacements, there might be sort of a conversation with the breeder to hope that they're selecting for the areas that will improve the maternal aspects of the flock. My kind of pet topic, I guess, is ewe nutrition. I do think that there is a big opportunity for nutrition to improve flock performance. I think it's probably, well, in my perspective, it's one of the bigger areas for improvement on many farms. I think this is a really good poster put together by QMS, and it just shows the timeline from, say, 50 days prior to tupping all the way through to weaning. And on this timeline, it has all these sort of key points throughout pregnancy and into lactation that make a difference. And I guess the eye sort of hones in quite quickly on the golden 20 days. So we know that this area, prime nutrition is key because it's 10 days either side of tupping. This is the time that is most influential to scanning percentage. And then the golden 35 days. I'm sure it's not news to many of you on the call, but we know that the last sort of 6 weeks of pregnancy, prime nutrition is important, and that's most influential to lamb mortality. But also it kind of breaks pregnancy up into these 50-day periods, and it gives you kind of hints and tips what's important. So the first 50 days, important to minimize stress and dietary change, as that's important for embryo survival. The middle 50 days is actually when maintenance is key, so maintaining condition. But actually at that time their nutritional demands aren't great, so that often coincides with the middle of winter, which is good, and then the last 50 days. And then along the bottom you can see the sort of industry condition score targets, and I should say these are lowland targets. Generally for hill farms it'll be one score less than the targets presented here. And these targets are nothing new, they were developed in the 60s. But there's more and more research which is really signposting to how these targets are influential to flock performance. You mentioned Chogas was on last week. They actually were able to quantify the value of one condition score at tupping time. So one's condition score between 1.5 and 4, they found on their research flocks is worth 10% more lambs reared. So not just 10% more lambs scanned, but 10% more lambs that are kept full term and actually sold or retained at the end of the season. So it's quite a substantial amount that one condition score can be worth. But there's plenty more research over, well, I know at SAUC is shown the influence of these targets to ewe mortality. And then there's been research done in France as well, which has really validated these targets. So I'm a massive fan of condition scoring, and I think making sure that you take this opportunity in the lead up to tapping to get as many on target as possible, but also checking them through mid-pregnancy, often around scanning time, and also in the lead up to lambing time, to take these opportunities to use this really effective gauge of whether the nutrition is correct. I think there's still opportunity on many flocks I'm seeing in Scotland anyway, for condition score to make a difference. But 10% more lambs reared, that's quite a difference found.
Poppy, I guess there was a ceiling on the body condition score if they were, if they were too conditioned, did that lower, or was it?
So like I say, it was up to 4 at tapping time. And actually, I don't know if Teoga's, well, there'll be Irish farmers on the call, but often their targets are a bit higher than ours. And the reason being is they seem to work quite well with triplets. I don't know, anyone might correct me if I'm wrong, but triplets and pet lambs, I think Irish farmers are quite adept at working with them. Not saying that we're not in the UK, but because flock size and practicalities and more extensive systems, triplets are something we find more challenging, perhaps. I don't know if anyone would like to correct me on that. But yeah, sorry, I didn't answer your question fully. But yeah, up to 4 was what the Teoga's work said.
Harry's got a question.
Yeah.
Or comment, I guess.
Yeah, just I'm struggling with my ewes being too fat.
Okay.
They when they look at a green field, they get fat. And they are kept very hard over the dry period of the summer. And they, I don't know, on the outside they seem well conditioned. I don't know, they lose condition on the inside around their organs and stuff like that. But once we get them on good grass to flush, yeah, they get very heavy. They're not big ewes, but they get extremely heavy.
What breed?
The Llyn Cross New Zealand Suffolks. And the variation from year to year in scanning percentage is 20%. I can go up to 190. We start lambing 10th of January. But I can go down to 170 as well. Generally, condition of the ewes are roughly the same annually, but at tapping time. But yeah, we've never been able to put our finger on why there's a big variation.
So do you think that, so tapping is consistent, but is the lead up to tapping inconsistent? You know, is there a lot of weight gain some years in the lead up to tapping?
Not in the last 5 years.
It's a, yeah.
I don't know, this year we're down a bit, down to 172. They've had more grass than usual, but I don't know, because we've had a wet 12 months or 18 months, we've had plenty of food, but not enough nutrition, if you know what I mean, in the grass. Is the grass less
diluted?
Yeah. All the soil, minerals and trace elements and stuff diluted. I don't know if that's an issue.
Yeah, okay. I guess how often are you monitoring condition at all? Like, are you going through them at weaning?
Yeah, by eye every time we sort them. At weaning, if there are thinner ones, they tend to go with the yearling ewes. they tend to get slightly better
Okay.
weight.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Without, I think I could probably talk too much maybe, but it's quite a complicated one. And I would say maybe weaning date could be shifted year to year according to the conditions. So if they're looking really good, perhaps wean them a bit later and keep the lambs on them a bit longer so they benefit from the milk. Is there a genetic way to, I don't know, cleanse and sound like quite a good breed base, but yeah, and I just think monitoring and adapting if as much as possible to try and reduce the condition on them if needs be. But it sounds fantastic if they're maintaining condition through lactation, rearing or scanning at 172%.
There is a comment in the chat saying they found that mineral supplementation can significantly alter the scanning percentage.
Yeah, I'm coming on. Well, actually, I haven't got mineral slides in here, but absolutely. If they are low, I think it starts from a point of investigating with bloods with the vets to understand what minerals are important. But we know iodine and selenium are influential to fertility in ewes. Absolutely.
I've tried everything under the sun when it comes to boluses and lakes, and I found no pattern or anything to it. But what my gut feeling is, but this year I possibly would have benefited hugely from a bolus or a mineral lake because it's been so wet. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, you know, but and the year we hit 190%, well, yeah, we didn't give them anything, and it was just a normal year. So
when are you lambing?
10th of January.
Okay.
Natural heat. Teasers go in for 2 weeks, and then yeah.
Okay, that's a tricky one. Sorry, I probably haven't answered the difficulty in managing that variation, but yeah, maybe I'll come back to it. But thanks for sharing anyway. Sorry, I haven't. Sure. Great. Okay. Yeah, you mentioned minerals, so I'll come on to this slide a bit as well. So of course, the scanning and the rearing percentage is one part of the flock efficiency. The other part is getting those lambs growing well. For one, dead animals stop producing methane. So the quicker we can get them growing and sold, the less methane they produce over their lifetime. But also selling lambs off the farm frees up resource for the breeding ewe flock so that there's more grass available for the breeding ewe flock. So they might go on to produce more lambs in the subsequent year. So genetics absolutely plays a role here. So selecting for genetics for direct for lamb growth and terminal sire genetics generally. I would say nutritionally, the first point of call would be the quality and quantity of forage available in front of the lambs. So we know that, you know, if we're looking at grass type systems, that the clover proportion of the sward's really influential to lamb growth, but also making sure that they're not being forced to graze too tight. So grazing less than 5 centimeters, it does have an impact on lamb growth rates. And I'll talk a bit more about other forages that might be in front of those animals. Worms, and we know with climate change that worm sort of patterns are shifting and becoming an increasing challenge to manage. But of course they are influential to lamb growth rates, particularly after 8 weeks. Any means to reduce the burden on the pasture, so cleaner grazing that they're going on to, perhaps silage aftermath or areas of the farm that weren't grazed by lambs or grazed by ewes earlier in the year. And monitoring like the fecal egg counts of the animals as well. kind of helps understand at least where the sort of dirtier parts of the farm are. And then lastly, cobalt. Cobalt is the key trace element that is influential to lamb growth post 8 weeks. A lot of the UK is deficient in cobalt. Again, I would suggest understanding whether deficiency is an issue in your flock, but I suspect many have this as a problem, and cobalt will benefit often lamb growth rates. And you can get sort of long-acting injections. So there was the Smart Shot, or I've forgotten the other name, or which last a longer time, or you can drench on a regular basis. Or there are the boluses available too. So I just wanted to come back to feed and fertilizer. Now, the reason I sort of harp on about feed is because any feed that's brought onto the farm comes with it all the emissions associated with the production of that feed. So that's why it can have a big impact on the carbon footprint. And different feeds will have different effects. So soya, for instance, will have quite a high emission level associated with it compared to its sort of counterpart as the rape meal that we can produce in the UK, which will have lower emissions associated with it. Byproducts tend to have lower emissions because the emissions are spread over 2 different products, so like distillers, wheat distillers. But also I would suggest that reducing dependency on bought-in feeds altogether, and I'll discuss how in a moment, again, can reduce your carbon footprint further. In terms of fertilizer, yeah, I'll come on to this. So basically, my suggestion is that if we can utilize the grass growing on the farm better, without growing any more, without investing much into the farm system, we can reduce our dependency on feed and fertilizer. And this is where rotational grazing comes in. So rotational grazing enables us to increase the utilization of any grass grown on the farm. So increase the amount of grass that goes down the animals' throats to produce meat, milk, wool, whatever the case may be. Because it's not grass you're selling at the end of the day, even though that's what you're physically growing, it's meat. And so the more we can utilize for meat production, the better. We might reduce our dependency on feed and fertilizer, or we might increase our production of meat per hectare. And grass is the most sustainable way to produce animals for a variety of reasons. So rotational grazing is very simply just increasing the stocking pressure. So often small paddocks and moving animals regularly, or it might be the case of bringing groups of animals together and increasing the stocking pressure that way. I would say a target entry height of about 8 to 10 centimetres, and using that target as an understanding, as a gauge of whether you've got the rotational grazing correct or not. So if it's much longer than your target, longer than 8 centimetres, that's an indication that you can reduce the rest in the system. Or if it's not quite reaching your target, then that's an indication you need to increase the rest. Because that rest period absolutely needs to be flexible according to the season. And then in terms of target out, I would say for high producing animals, so like I said in the lambs, 5 centimetres ideally. If it's perhaps animals like weaned ewes, you might graze that bit tighter, but in the 4 to 5 centimetre range. And if you're struggling to graze down, that's an indication that the stocking pressure isn't quite right, and you might want to decrease paddock size or increase stock numbers. When it comes to kind of achieving the balance between that nice quality grass throughout the rotation, whilst also keeping those animals performing well, it's quite tricky. Because if you don't graze, might let animals sort of skim the best stuff off the grass, and they'll grow really well in the short term, but it means that quality will deteriorate in the long term. And for that reason, practices such as leader-follower grazing, where the sheep are followed with cattle, grazing no more than 2 paddocks behind, they can do the tidy up job so that the high-performing animals, our lovely flock of sheep, are still continuing to grow their lambs well. In the absence of cattle, that's where there's no harm in going in and topping so that you keep those animals growing well, but also you maintain those quality residuals. For those that are, just wanting to get started, so this example is based on 8 paddocks with 200 to 250 ewes and lambs, grazing 3 days and providing a 3-week rest period. That's quite a nice, simple structure, and it enables you to adapt according to the target in as your gauge. But as a even sort of simpler starting point, which will yield a benefit, just splitting a field in half and moving stock between each half will benefit that grass utilisation and therefore reduce that dependency on potential inputs. And the reason I harp on about grass quite a lot is because grass is a really important store of soil carbon. Okay, so 60% of the UK's total soil carbon is stored in grasslands. So businesses based around grass are really important. People like yourselves are really important to conserving that soil carbon. Because we've lost a lot of carbon since the development of agriculture. And yes, some of that grassland is in sort of rough grazing areas that can't be turned over, but some of it isn't. And if it's turned over, we lose that important star. This diagram just shows with time, so from conversion from arable to grass, we see a sharp increase in soil carbon and it plateaus at around 100 years. So that store is quick, it's easily lost, and it takes a long time to get it back to where we were at grassland. But also what's important to note in this graph is it doesn't continue to build over time. It does plateau. So the soils do become what we call saturated in carbon. But this is why land use change is influential to your carbon footprint. I see there's a question. I don't know.
Do you want me to ask? So it's one of the chaps from Northern Ireland has said their local advisor suggests that 6-day paddocks work better for ewes and lambs after lambs reach 8 weeks. Reason being the ewes are bullying the lambs in the 3rd day away from the best forage. Better that the lambs only have a hard time every 6 days.
6 paddocks, did you say? Sorry. Okay.
6-day paddocks work better for ewes and lambs. I think.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. I hadn't heard that actually, but yeah, I mean the thing is with any sort of rotational grazing with sheep anyways, some have observed that it does reduce the weaning weight of lambs, but it does increase the production per hectare. And therefore it can, displace the feed and fertilizer through the improved utilization, but it can, the individual performance can be reduced. So perhaps, yeah, a more perhaps the rotational grazing system is better. Okay, thank you. Was that all? Was it?
Yeah, that's all for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so just staying on the carbon sequestration topic, there's a lot to be said for diversity in the sward. Diversity generally is good because what you see above the sward is often you see diversity below ground as well. So if there's lots of different roots at different depths, they're sort of capturing more of the area beneath the soil, beneath the ground, and tends to result in greater soil carbon sequestration. So this is seen in this paper here. You can see that the soil carbon storage was beneficial with greater number of species. There was greater soil carbon sequestration. And as you see, the different rooting depths can be seen across a number of different species here. And also it's beneficial for biodiversity, which I'm not going to go into right now. This was work done by, sorry, it's probably a busy graph, but anyways, this is University College Dublin group, and they showed the effect of nitrogen application on the yield of different combinations of grass. Let me just check. Grass, legume, and herbs. Okay, so this one's 100% grass. This one's 40% grass, 60% legume. This one's 40% grass. This one's 60% herbs. And what they showed is that with and then this is the yield seen here. And the lines with that are going kind of responding well to the increasing nitrogen, these are the lines without legume in that mix. As you increase the legume in that mix, you see these lines begin to flatten. They don't respond to that increasing fertilizer due to the nitrogen fixing properties of the legumes. To the extent that even this one at the top, which is 40% grass, 60% legume, is yielding far above these mixes that are responding here to the nitrogen fertilizer. And then the dotted line here is a grass with grass only with 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare applied. So this top line is exceeding the grass only with 250 kilos of nitrogen. I guess the summary of this is how phenomenal, like increasing legume content of the sward, what an impact it can have on reducing your need for fertilizer altogether. And I will say this would have been a young grassley, which is why you're seeing the sort of amazing responses that you're seeing, but still legumes do have this potential to reduce fertilizer quite substantially. And then the same group under the Smart Grass Project, and this was presented by Tommy Boland, University College Dublin, showed the benefit of different mixes. So perennial ryegrass and white clover, a 6-species mix and a 9-species mix on the weaning weight of lambs. And you can see that the clear winner here was the 6-species mix, which compared to just perennial ryegrass alone, led to lambs that weaned 2.4 kilos higher live weight at weaning. So you can see that these mixes enable us to reduce fertilizer inputs, but 2, these mixes enable us to improve flock efficiency through the benefit to lamb growth rates. So we're seeing a lot of an increase in popularity of these multi-species swards, certainly in Scotland anyway. I don't know what's seen by yourselves, but I'm also seeing a lot of instances of it not going well. The reason being is that these multi-species swards do need to be managed differently to standard ryegrass and clover. They need longer rest. So when I talked about rotational grazing there, and a 21-day rest period, I would add another 5 days for swards with greater content of herbs. So you're talking about more of like a 25 and above day rest period. They also need to be left a bit longer when the animals come out. So this is a sward stick produced in New Zealand by Massey University. And their recommendation, based on their research, was that for a multi-species sward, the animals should be removed at 7 centimetres. Stock should be in about 15 centimetres, out at 7. So in order for us to maintain persistency of these species, so they're not grazed out too tightly by the animals, we need to adapt how we manage it. Now, I know no two farms version of a multi-species sward will be very different. So the general rule is, with increased inclusion of these different herbs and clovers, you go more to this sort of textbook way of managing multi-species swards with greater inclusion of grasses and white clover, you might move to my previous diagram of in at 8 and out at 5. So it's a bit of a sliding scale. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch a little bit, on agroforestry, just to kind of dispel perhaps one of the myths on agroforestry, but also allude to some of the opportunities with it. Agroforestry doesn't seem to have a huge impact on soil organic carbon, SOCs, in terms of if we change, say, grassland to agroforestry across a number of papers, the change in soil carbon is quite small. However, of course, in forestry systems, and that might be just hedgerows, it might be shelter belts, it doesn't necessarily need to be these rows of trees in a field. But because of the woody biomass in these plants, there is opportunity for more carbon to be stored, and that will yield a benefit in the farm carbon footprint. And I just wanted to allude to, and I know there's huge practical issues in terms of tenancy, in terms of land value change and categorization change, but there is, just looking at the carbon side of that equation, there is potential for us to offset and reduce the emissions on a farm by planting more trees on farm, which we know has benefits to livestock in terms of shelter and shade, and also to biodiversity as well. So where practical, I think there is a place for hedgerows and trees on farm. And lastly, I just wanted to say I've talked all about carbon, and I think it's important to note that there's much more to the story than just carbon. This was a little project we did back in 2022 where we went around a few farms, and we sort of, just as a little exercise, we kind of scored them, not just on the carbon side of things, but biodiversity, soil health, animal health and welfare, resilience to weather, resilience to markets, quality of life, as well as, of course, food production. Because there's a whole host of things, and I know that, like I said at the start, there's this growing list that we are asking of you, but I think as livestock farmers, it's a whole host of things that we can celebrate, because you're doing a lot more than just producing food. And like I say, it's not just the carbon is just one element of that picture. So I see I probably rambled on too much, but my sort of take homes from this evening would be consider any opportunities to improve flock efficiency. It's good not just for carbon, but also for the bottom line. I think there is opportunity on a number of farms to replace feed and fertilizer with grass through better utilization. I think, a lot of flocks are grass-based businesses, and it's important that we conserve that valuable soil carbon, but also celebrate the other positives that you bring to the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Poppy. Has anyone got any questions? Do you want to unshare your screen, Poppy, so we'll hopefully be able to see more people when some questions hopefully come in? Either use the raise your hand function, or I know we've taken questions as we've gone in through, but someone else must have a question. No one's got any questions for Poppy.
I'm just catching up on some of the chat. I didn't see all that come through.
Yeah, no, there was just a bit about, would you use a drenching bucket or a bolus?
Right.
Chat there. I think that was all the. And someone saying that triplets are trouble right at the start.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
James, have you got a question, Liz? Do you want to unmute? We're using raise your hand instead of.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Liz just raised her hand.
only really to talk about our experience of herbal lays, establishing herbal lays and managing herbal lays. Because like many other people, we've gone full on into SFI. We've also got a more direct drill, which we've done a lot of drilling in herbal mixes into existing lays, and that just does not work at all. It's complete failure. The only way we seem to be able to establish a herbal lay is doing a full reseed, and then the reseed comes up well in the autumn, and by the spring there's no herbs in it.
Okay. Has the frost got them, or do you think?
Sorry?
Frost?
No, I think they just don't compete with the grass. You know, if the grass establishes well, then the herbs just disappear. And we just went on a farm walk that was organised by ABP, all to do with herbal lays, and the farm that we were on that was putting in another 400 acres of herbal lays was having exactly the same experience as us.
Okay.
And they were basically, I spoke to the farmer afterwards, and it was all about just getting the SFI payments. And the woman that did the talk from ADHB was saying the same thing. She said, as long as you've kept your invoices for your herbs and then take some photographs of you drilling it, and some that have come up in the first year, then that's your protection for the payments for the full 3 years. But it all seems very wrong.
It does, particularly when you think of the resource going into growing that seed, for it to be wasted.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for sharing. I think, well, I've seen it done well if it's in an undersow context. So I do work with a few organic farmers, and they use like an arable silage as a means of reseeding, and they've grown the multi-species under an arable silage, and that seems to have worked well. So I guess that kind of keeps the grass competition down, and they've still managed to take hold. But yeah, the grass is quite hard. Yeah, they've done quite well at breeding grass that's persistent and competitive. Yeah, so reducing the grass in the mix, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a bit of a difficult one because then a lot of the herbs are not very, or they've got quite a short growing season.
Yeah.
So because we're looking to graze all year round, so we've sold all our ewes, as we were talking about last year. We've sold all the ewes, replaced them all with New Zealand Romneys. So we're not going to house the ewes at all, and they're all going to lamb outside, whatever the weather, and finish all the lambs off grass.
Yeah.
Or grass and herbal lays, but we're just not finding that the herbal lay is persistent enough. The only thing that was, because we've got a dairy as well, so we're grazing cows on herbal lays, and we no longer put the chicory in the herbal lays because nothing seems to like the chicory, and it goes woody and it looks nice because it flowers. You take some nice photographs of it for SFI, but the animals don't like
it.
And it's a real pest, to be honest.
Chicory is
is good, but
yeah, chicory is a pain to manage. It just wants to bolt quite quickly. Plantain keeps its quality that bit better, so even the seed head is better quality, than relative to what grass does when it goes to seed. With that being your experience, I mean, I know the SFI payments muddy the waters a bit, but I would say clover is the low hanging fruit in terms of the production. Then just ways to increase clover proportion of the sward.
Yeah, no, I mean that's kind of what we've come to, that we will always do our reseeds with some herbs mixed in because we still want to do it. But I think very much similar to the farm walk we went on, Guy was saying, we will continue putting herbal lays in, but realistically, we've only got the herbs there for the first season.
Yeah, and then you end up.
And then you've got a good, normal grass and white clover reseed. That's
It's not a bad outcome. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know whether this is useful, James, but I know I think it was one of the meetings last year. Someone said the mixes, what works well in one region often varies. So I don't know if there's other people locally that are growing herbal leis that have got good positive experiences, but I know one of the meetings last year, definitely people were saying it does vary on what works well in different soils and different areas. So it might be worth trying to speak to some other people that might be doing it and seeing, you know, whether it's a different mix or different companies or whatever that might work possibly better in your area. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I know plantains are funny. People often say looking at the margins and look at what grows naturally, because often you'll see the natural plantain doing all right and natural herbs coming through. It's a signpost maybe for what works.
Yep.
Any other questions from anyone? Our colleagues overseas have been very quiet this evening, but thank you very much, Poppy. If we've got no further questions, then I just thank you, Poppy, for sharing your expertise this evening. And if anyone does come up with any questions that you want me to ask Poppy, then just let me know and I can ask her and share with everybody else. But thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
You.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
Carl, have you got one last minute? But I think we've already just ended. Pop it in the chat, Carl, if you're still there.